Welcome to the quiet history of human agriculture, the story of how we learned to feed the world. Before we begin this journey, I invite you to get truly comfortable. Go ahead and adjust your blankets, let your head sink into the pillow, and allow your breathing to slow down. There is no need to hurry here. I often wonder where you are tuning in from tonight. Is it late evening for you? Or is this an early morning escape in your perfectly chaotic schedule? Whatever the time, I hope you feel at peace. If you find these moments of calm helpful, a simple follow ensures we can always find our way back to this quiet place. Now, let us travel back together. Imagine you are with a small band of people thousands of years ago in the green lands between two rivers. For as long as anyone can remember, you have foraged for food, always moving with the seasons. But you have started to notice something. You see how seeds that fall to the ground sprout again, and a revolutionary idea begins to take root. The journey back to the winter camp was quieter than usual. The hunters walked with their shoulders slumped, their spears feeling heavier than they had a week before. Elara's small band of people moved through the familiar hills, their eyes scanning the landscape, not with anticipation, but with a low, persistent worry that gnawed at the edges of every thought. The gazelles had been scarce this season, their tracks faint and scattered. Back at the camp, nestled in a curve of the river, the mood was just as subdued. The sound of women grinding the last of the gathered seeds against stone was a slow, rhythmic reminder of their dwindling supplies, a sound that spoke of scarcity with each scrape and turn. This constant, hollow feeling in her belly drove Elara further from the camp each day, her leather pouch swinging emptily at her side. As she dug for tough, stringy roots with a sharpened stick, her gaze fell upon a patch of wild grass near the old refuse pile, a spot where they had discarded grain husks and scraps from the previous year. She stopped, her stick halfway into the hard soil. This grass was different. It stood taller than the surrounding clumps, its stalks thicker and a richer shade of gold. It looked stronger, more confident, as if it had drunk more deeply from the earth and felt more of the sun's warmth. This observation was not a thought, but a feeling, a deep recognition that passed from her eyes to her empty stomach. She moved closer, her fingers tracing the heavy seed heads. They were fuller and packed more tightly with kernels than any she had gathered in the wilder fields. The seeds felt like tiny, hard promises in her palm. A memory, soft as smoke from the evening fire, surfaced in her mind. Her grandmother, years ago, tossing a handful of seeds into the wind and murmuring that the earth was a generous mother who sometimes gave back what was offered to her. It had sounded like a story then, a way to explain the world. Now, standing before this patch of impossibly healthy wheat, it felt less like a story and more like a secret waiting to be understood. Driven by a desperation that overshadowed caution, Elara made a choice. She spent the rest of the day carefully stripping the seeds from every stalk in the special patch. She did not take them to the grinding stones. Instead, she carried her precious collection, a double handful of potential, to a small, clear patch of earth near the camp's spring. The ground there was dark and moist, and it seemed to hum with a quiet energy. The gnawing ache in her gut was still there, but now it was joined by a fragile flutter of purpose. She wasn't just gathering anymore. She was preparing for something uncertain. An elder, his face a map of wrinkles carved by seasons of hardship, watched her from a distance. He saw her using her digging stick not to unearth roots, but to scratch lines in the soil. He walked over, his steps slow and deliberate. "What are you doing, girl?" he asked, his voice rough like bark. "There is no food in the dirt. Your family is hungry. You should be searching, not playing games with the ground." His words were not unkind, but they were heavy with the weight of tradition, of doing things the way they had always been done, because it was the only known path to survival. He saw her actions as a waste of precious energy, a foolish distraction from the real work of finding food. Elara did not have the words to explain the hope she felt. How could she describe the heavy seeds or the echo of her grandmother's voice? So she said nothing, merely looking down at the small pouch in her hands. The elder shook his head slowly and walked away, leaving her alone with her strange task. His disapproval was a cold weight, another challenge to her fragile idea. For a moment, she questioned herself, her hands hesitating over the soil. The old ways were proven. They had kept her people alive for generations. Her idea was just a whisper, a guess, based on a patch of grass and a half-remembered story. But the image of the tall, golden wheat was too strong to ignore. She pushed aside the doubt and knelt, taking a single seed from her pouch. It was so small, so simple. It seemed impossible that it could hold the answer to the hunger that shadowed her community. One by one, she pushed the seeds into the cool, damp earth. With each one, she felt a quiet connection to the ground beneath her, a silent conversation taking place. She was not demanding, but asking. It was a gesture of trust, an offering made not to a spirit in the sky, but to the soil itself. The sun was low by the time she finished, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the valley. Her back ached, and her fingers were stained with dirt. She had nothing to show for her day's work but a patch of disturbed earth. The other women were returning to camp, their own pouches heavier with roots and berries than hers. She could feel their curious glances, hear their hushed whispers. To them, she had spent a day on a child's fancy, while the bellies of their children remained unfilled. Her act was one of profound and lonely hope. As she pressed the very last seed into the ground, she felt a sense of finality. She had taken a risk, diverting her energy from the immediate need for food toward a future that might never arrive. She had traded the certainty of a few more roots for the possibility of something much greater. There was no guarantee the seeds would sprout, no promise the rains would come, no assurance that her small act of faith would be rewarded. All she knew was that she had to try something different, because the old ways were no longer enough. Around the small camp, the familiar sounds of the evening began their ancient rhythm. The crackle of the fire, the murmur of voices sharing stories of the day's meager finds, the distant cry of a night bird. Elara washed the dirt from her hands in the cold spring water, her gaze fixed on the small, unassuming patch of earth. In a world governed by the relentless cycle of the hunt and the harvest of the wild, she had just set in motion a change whose shape she could not yet imagine. She had planted a seed of hope in the face of despair. The seasons had turned. The biting winds that had once scoured the valley floor had softened, replaced by a steady warmth that drew moisture from the earth. For Kael, this was the time of the great migration, the season when the world came alive with the thunder of hooves. His body knew the rhythm of it, the ache in his shoulders from long days of tracking, the satisfying weight of a spear in his hand, the sharp focus of his eyes scanning the horizon for the telltale shimmer of a distant herd. This year, however, the rhythm was broken. Instead of following the gazelle, his people remained anchored to this small patch of land by a spring, their eyes fixed not on the vast plains, but on a patch of defiant green. It was Elara's wheat, rising from the soil in thin, hopeful stalks, a sight that filled most with wonder, but left a cold stone of unease in Kael's stomach. His hands, calloused and shaped by the grip of a spear and the curve of a skinning knife, felt foolishly large and clumsy among the delicate plants. He had tried, at the urging of Elara's father, to help pull the stubborn weeds that grew between the wheat. The work was tedious, forcing him into a crouch that made his back ache in a way no hunt ever had. He felt the dirt under his nails, a gritty reminder of how grounded they had become. This new work required a patience he did not possess. It was a language of waiting, of watching the sky and tending the soil, a language he did not understand. His skills, honed over a lifetime of pursuit and provision, felt suddenly irrelevant. The world he knew was one of movement, of reading tracks in the dust and understanding the subtle shift of the wind. This new world was one of stillness, and it felt like a cage. The change was most apparent in the young men. Kael watched them, their gazes lifted not to the distant hills where game might appear, but to the clouds, their conversations filled with whispers of rain. They spoke of the color of the wheat, the thickness of the stalks, the signs of pests. They spent their days clearing stones with digging sticks, their movements slow and deliberate, their world shrinking to the size of this single, fragile field. Kael saw the strength in their arms being used to pull weeds instead of drawing a bow. He saw their keen eyes, which should have been learning to spot a flicker of movement in the tall grass, instead focused on tiny green shoots. A bitterness grew in him as he realized they were learning the ways of the earth, but forgetting the ways of the hunt that had sustained their people for generations beyond counting. This growing tension finally broke one evening around the communal fire. The hunters had returned with only 2 small hares, barely enough to flavor the thin gruel of ground roots. The familiar scent of roasting meat was absent, and the silence around the flames was filled with a quiet anxiety. Kale could bear it no longer. He stood and faced Elara's father, his voice low but carrying the weight of his conviction. He spoke of the gazelle herds, which would now be moving through the northern passes, their coats sleek and their bodies fat from the new grass. He described the familiar path, the certainty of the hunt, the promise of full bellies and strong hides for the winter. To stay here, he argued, was to gamble their survival on a patch of grass that a single hailstorm or a swarm of locusts could destroy in moments. Elara's father, his face illuminated by the firelight, listened without interruption. When Kale finished, the older man did not look to the distant hills, but gestured toward the dark shape of the field. He spoke of a different kind of certainty. He reminded them of the gnawing hunger of the past winter, of the days spent searching for scarce roots while their children cried. The field, he explained, was not a gamble, but an anchor. It was a promise that, if they tended it, they would not have to chase their food across the plains. Food would grow right where they lived. His words were calm, but they drew a line in the sand, dividing their small community into two camps: those who trusted the ancient rhythms of the hunt, and those who saw a new future in the deliberate planting of seeds. The debate rippled through the camp for days. Families spoke in hushed tones, torn between two deeply ingrained instincts: the nomadic urge to move and the newfound hope of a permanent home. Kale saw the conflict in the eyes of his fellow hunters. They felt the pull of the open plains, the freedom of a life lived in motion, but they also remembered the hunger. The women, who spent their days grinding what little grain they had and tending to the children, seemed to look upon the green field with a fierce protectiveness. It represented a life where they would not have to pack up their meager belongings every few weeks, a place where their children could grow without the constant threat of a failed hunt. Kyle felt his own certainty wavering. He would wake in the pre-dawn chill, his muscles tensed and ready to begin a long day's trek, only to remember there was nowhere to go. He would stand at the edge of the camp, his spear feeling like a useless stick in his hand, and look out at the vast, empty horizon. He saw the freedom he cherished, but for the first time, he also saw its emptiness. The camp behind him, once a temporary collection of hide tents, was beginning to look more permanent. People were reinforcing their shelters, digging deeper fire pits, and even creating a small shared space for storing the digging sticks and clay pots. They were building a home, not just a camp, and he felt like a stranger within it. The decision, when it came, was not made with a great declaration, but with a quiet, collective turning away from the open plains. The elders gathered and spoke for a long time, their voices a low murmur that blended with the sound of the wind. They did not command, they listened. They weighed the fear of starvation against the fear of confinement, the certainty of the past against the promise of the future. In the end, the choice was made to stay, at least until the first harvest. They would wait to see if Elara's vision would bear fruit. If the grain came in, they would have a store for the winter. If it failed, they would be weakened, but there would still be time to hunt before the harshest cold set in. For many, the decision brought a sense of relief, a release from the tension that had gripped them. They turned to their tasks with renewed purpose, their movements now aligned with a single, shared goal. They worked together to build a low fence of thorny branches around the field to keep out wild animals, their shared labor creating a new kind of bond between them. The sounds of the camp changed. The sharp flaking of flint for spearheads grew less common, replaced by the rhythmic scraping of sticks against soil and the soft murmur of people working side by side. The community was reshaping itself around this small plot of cultivated land. Cale accepted the decision, for he was bound to his people. But a profound sense of loss settled over him. He felt as if a tether, once invisible but strong, now connected him directly to that patch of green wheat. It held him in place, pulling him back every time his gaze drifted toward the distant, rolling hills he had once roamed without a second thought. He was a hunter, a man of endless horizons and swift movement, and yet his fate was now tied to the slow, silent growth of a plant. The world felt smaller, more confined, the sky itself seeming to press down upon him. He often walked to the edge of the settlement in the evening when the others were gathered around their fires. He would stand there alone, looking out at the landscape that had been his map, his larder, and his entire existence. The wind still carried the scent of distant rain and dry earth, the familiar smells of his old life. He could almost feel the phantom weight of a full pack on his shoulders, and hear the soft tread of his companions as they moved silently through the bush. But when he turned back, he saw the flickering lights of the camp, a small, permanent spark in the vast darkness. It was a strange feeling, this mixture of safety and confinement. Part of him acknowledged the wisdom in staying. He saw the hope in the faces of the children and knew that a full granary was a better inheritance than a well-worn hunting trail. Yet another part of him mourned the loss of the freedom he had never even known to question. The world had always been a place to move through, not a place to stay in. He wondered if the skills that defined him, the instincts that had kept his family alive, would one day be nothing more than stories told to children who had never known the thrill of a chase. His hands, which had once been a source of pride, now seemed a symbol of his displacement. He would rub the calluses on his palms, the tough skin a testament to a life that felt like it was slipping away. He was Cale the hunter, but what was a hunter without the great herds to follow? What was a man of the plains when his people chose to be tethered to a single field? This small patch of wheat held the promise of a future free from starvation, but for Cale, it also represented the end of a world he loved. The soft rustle of the growing wheat stalks in the evening breeze sounded less like a promise and more like the whisper of a closing door. Cale stood looking out at the hills, the familiar shapes dark against the fading light, and felt the invisible tether pull tight. The decision had been made, and he was bound to it, a nomad held captive by a handful of seeds. The faint scent of damp earth from the tended field lingered in the twilight as he contemplated all that had been lost and all that might be gained by this choice to remain still. While Elara's people bound themselves to the dry earth and Kale mourned the loss of the open plains, a different story was unfolding in a land far across the world, guided not by the scarcity of rain, but by the overwhelming abundance of water. Here, along the banks of a great churning river the color of yellow clay, life moved to a different rhythm. For the people of this valley, the river was both a creator and a destroyer, a spirit that gave and took without warning. Each year, they watched it swell, spill its banks, and cover their world in a thick blanket of life-giving mud. This annual gift was the secret to their survival, for it was in this wet, messy soil that a special kind of starchy grass grew wild, its grains providing the substance of their meals. This dependence on the river's mood made life a constant gamble. The people knew the signs of the rising water, and when the time came, they would retreat to higher ground, watching their homes of bamboo and thatch become small islands in a vast temporary sea. When the water pulled back, it left behind a transformed world, slick with fertile silt, perfect for the wild grass to sprout. But the river was fickle. Some years, the flood was a raging monster, tearing away huts and washing away the precious seeds before they could take root. Other years, the water barely rose at all, leaving the ground hard and cracked, and the people with empty baskets and emptier bellies. This cycle of fear and gratitude was the only life they had ever known. Among them was a young woman named Leon, who found more peace in watching the river than in fearing it. While others saw a single powerful entity, Leon saw countless smaller movements within the whole. She spent her days not in the village square, but by the water's edge, her feet sinking into the cool, soft mud. With a sharp piece of slate, she would carve little channels in the bank, watching how the water eagerly followed the new paths she made. She saw how it swirled around a well-placed stone, and how it slowed to a crawl in a wider, shallower trench. To her, the water was not a beast to be feared, but a force that could be guided, persuaded, if one only understood its nature. This quiet observation eventually blossomed into a daring idea, one that felt both brilliant and deeply disrespectful in her own mind. She watched the older women slapping handfuls of the wild grain against woven baskets, their movements practiced and efficient, but their faces etched with the familiar worry of the coming season. She saw the men reinforcing the stilts of their homes, preparing for a flood they could neither predict nor control. The thought came to her not as a sudden flash, but as a slow, steady current like the river itself. What if they did not wait for the flood to come to them? What if they could bring a small, tame piece of the river to a place of their own choosing? She carried this idea with her for days, the weight of it pressing on her chest. To challenge the river's ancient rhythm felt like challenging the spirits of her ancestors. Finally, gathering a courage she did not know she possessed, Leon approached the village elders as they sat mending fishing nets in the shade of a great banyan tree. Her voice, usually soft, trembled as she explained her vision. She spoke not of commanding the river, but of inviting it. She described a wide, flattened field protected by a low earthen wall, and a long, shallow channel that could gently lead the water from the river's main flow into their prepared basin. The elders listened, their hands never ceasing their work, their faces unreadable. The eldest, a man named Wei, whose skin was as cracked and weathered as a dried riverbed, finally paused. He looked at Leon, his eyes clouded with the memories of countless floods. He spoke of the river's spirit, a powerful and jealous thing that did not like to be told where to go. He reminded her of the years the river had torn their world apart, and he questioned the wisdom of provoking it. His words were not unkind, but they were heavy with the caution of a life spent at the mercy of an untamable force. Another elder, however, saw things differently. He spoke of his own children, of their thin arms and the quiet hunger that haunted the village during the dry years. He argued that the spirits rewarded courage, not just submission. The debate spread from the shade of the tree into the village itself, a low hum of anxious conversation that mixed with the sounds of daily life. Families were divided. Some saw Leon's plan as a path to security, a way to finally quiet the gnawing uncertainty that governed their lives. Others saw it as an act of profound arrogance, a dangerous game that could bring the full wrath of the river down upon them all.
The conflict was not one of anger or ambition, but of deep existential fear against a fragile seed of hope. It was a struggle against their own history, against the ingrained belief that their role was to endure nature, not to shape it. They were not fighting each other, but the immense, unseen power that had dictated their every move for generations. For days, the village felt suspended in time, caught between the old way of passive survival and a new path that required a monumental collective effort. Ultimately, the memory of the last bad season, of scraping mud for stray roots and rationing every single grain, tipped the balance. The elders gave their consent, their faces a mixture of hope and trepidation. The decision, once made, settled over the village like a new kind of silence. They were no longer waiting for their fate to be delivered by the water. They were now setting out to carve it from the earth themselves. The gamble was enormous, and every person knew that failure would mean not just a lost season of work, but perhaps the loss of everything. The work began at dawn the next day. The entire village moved as one body, their individual fears and hopes merging into a single purpose. Men used heavy wooden shovels to dig the main channel, their muscles straining against the dense, wet soil. Women and children formed long lines, passing woven baskets of excavated earth from hand to hand to build the low walls of the future paddy field. The sounds of rhythmic digging and shared work chants replaced the usual village chatter. Linden worked alongside them, her hands once delicate from observation, now blistered and caked with mud. Days turned into weeks. The sun warmed their backs, and they paused often to scoop water from clay pots left in the shade. The channel grew longer, a scar of human will upon the landscape, inching its way from the chosen field toward the mighty river. There were moments of doubt, times when a section of the channel wall would collapse, or when the sheer scale of the task felt overwhelming. In those moments, they would look at one another, at the sweat on their neighbors' brows and the determination in their eyes, and find the strength to pick up their tools and dig again.
Finally, the day came when only a thin wall of earth separated their new channel from the river. A hush fell over the assembled villagers. Wei, the eldest, stepped forward and offered a prayer to the river spirit, a plea for forgiveness and a promise of respect. Then, with a single symbolic strike of his shovel, he broke the barrier. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, a small trickle of brown water seeped through, followed by another and another. Slowly, hesitantly, the river turned, sending a gentle tongue of water down the path they had made for it. A collective breath was released, a sound that was half cheer and half sob. The water flowed, clear and calm, down the channel and into the flattened, waiting field. It spread out, forming a perfect, shallow pool that mirrored the sky above. It was a captive piece of the river, tame and obedient. In that quiet moment, as Lian watched the water settle into its new home, she could almost forget the immense and unpredictable power that still raged just a few hundred paces away. A power they had not conquered, but had, for now, learned to dance with. The seasons had turned many times since Elara first pressed seeds into the earth. Her village, once a tentative cluster of hide and timber huts huddled by a spring, had grown. More families, drawn by the promise of full bellies, had arrived, clearing new fields that stretched further into the valley. In the center of the settlement stood a new structure, solid and windowless, built of sun-baked clay bricks and roofed with thick thatch. This was the granary, and inside it, Zohar ran his hands through a river of wheat. The kernels were cool and smooth, a cascade of amber life that smelled of dry earth and sun. He was the keeper of this wealth, a role that did not exist in his father's time, and the trust of the community felt heavier than any stone he had ever lifted.
This abundance brought a quiet confidence to the village. The children's laughter was louder, and the old songs of the hunt were sung less often than the new songs of the harvest. Zohar's job was to measure the grain each family brought after threshing, marking their contribution on a notched stick he kept hung by the door. In return, he ensured the store was safe from rats and damp, a fortress of food that stood against the uncertainties of the world. He felt a deep satisfaction in his work, seeing the collective effort of his people piled high around him. The granary was more than just a building. It was a promise they had all made to one another, that no one would starve if the gazelle ran scarce or the nut harvest failed. That promise was tested on an afternoon when the sky turned the color of a bruise. While the sun shone on the southern fields, a strange, violent storm descended upon the northern plots. Zohar watched from the entrance of the granary as pellets of ice, some as large as his thumb, hammered the earth. The sound was like 1,000 stones being thrown at once, shredding the broad leaves of the barley and beating the heavy heads of wheat into the mud. It was a cruel, targeted assault of nature, lasting only moments but leaving ruin in its wake. When it passed, the air was cold and still, and the families who worked the northern fields emerged from their homes to stare at the wreckage of their year's labor. They came to Zohar not long after, their shoulders slumped in defeat and their faces streaked with rain and dirt. A woman named Mara, her voice trembling, spoke for them. "Zohar, our fields are lost. Everything is gone." She gestured back toward the flattened crops. "We have nothing to put in our own storage pits for the winter. You must give us a share from the community store." Her plea was simple, born of the old way of thinking, the shared struggle against hunger that had bound them together for generations. Zohar's heart went out to them. He knew their children and had helped them clear the very fields now lying in ruin. He looked at the vast stores behind him, a mountain of security meant for exactly this kind of disaster. Before he could answer, another man, Hadad, pushed his way to the front. His fields on the south side had been untouched by the hail, and his face was hard. "Wait," he said, his voice sharp and clear. "You cannot simply give it away. My family worked from dawn until dusk. My son's hands are blistered. The grain in that storehouse is marked. It belongs to those who contributed it." He pointed a finger, not at Zohar, but at Mara. "Your misfortune is sad, but it is not ours to pay for. We filled our quota." The crowd grew silent, the newness of the argument hanging between them. The notched stick by the door, once a simple record of contribution, had suddenly become a symbol of ownership. Zohar felt trapped between two different worlds. One was the world of shared fate he had always known, where the success of one was the success of all, and the suffering of one was a burden for all to carry. The other was a new world, born from the surplus, a world of individual effort and earned reward. Hadad's argument was not without reason. He had worked hard, and the grain he grew was the direct result of his family's sweat. Mara's plea was not just about food. It was an appeal to the very soul of their community. Zohar looked from the desperate faces of the northern families to the defiant stare of Hadad. He was no elder, no great hunter, just the man chosen to guard the grain. Yet now they were all looking to him, waiting for a decision he was not sure he had the right to make. His gaze fell upon the granary door, solid and impassive. It was meant to keep pests and moisture out, but it had also created a division between what was inside and what was outside, between what was saved and what was needed. He thought of the notched sticks, each mark representing a basket of grain, a day of labor. Were they simply a record, or were they a title to a specific pile of kernels within the store? The concept was so new, it made his head ache. He knew whatever he did now would not be forgotten. His choice would become the rule, a precedent carved into the memory of the village for all the harvests to come. The granary was no longer just a place for food. It was now a place of judgment. Zohar took a deep breath, the dry, clean scent of the wheat doing little to calm the pounding in his chest. He turned to Hadad first. "You are right," he said, his voice slow and deliberate, carrying in the quiet. "Your family worked hard, and your grain is in this store." Then he turned to Mara. "And you are right. Your family is part of this village, and the village does not let its own starve." He walked back into the granary and picked up a large scooping basket. He did not go to the pile where Hadad's grain was stored, nor to the piles of the other southern families. Instead, he walked to a smaller pile in the corner, one set aside from the very beginning, a portion from every single family, designated as the community's share for brewers, toolmakers, and the elderly. Every family gave a small part of their harvest for the good of all, Zohar announced, his voice growing stronger. This share belongs to no single family, but to everyone. He scooped a full measure from this communal pile and carried it out to Mara. "This will feed your family for now. Tomorrow, the elders will meet. We will decide how every family, north and south, will help you replant a winter crop." He looked directly at Hadad. "Because one day the hail might fall on your fields, and you will need the help of the whole village." Hadad's jaw was tight, but he did not argue further. He had not lost his own grain, but a new rule had been made clear. A portion of everyone's labor belonged to the community. As Mara and her family accepted the grain with tears of relief, Zohar felt the profound shift. He was no longer just a keeper of food. He was now an administrator of wealth, a judge in disputes. He had navigated the first challenge to his authority, but he knew it would not be the last. The questions of who owned what, who deserved what, and who decided would only grow more complicated as the granary swelled with future harvests. The simple act of storing surplus grain had changed everything. The village had solved the problem of hunger, but in doing so had created new and unfamiliar problems of fairness and control. Zohar looked at the solid clay walls of the granary, a structure built to provide security for all. He now understood that its smooth, silent walls contained not just wheat and barley, but the seeds of power, division, and law. The weight of the grain had woven itself so deeply into their world that it now shaped their arguments as much as it filled their stomachs. Across the world, in the highlands where the air was thin and cool, Izel moved between the neat rows of his family's future. The maize stalks, already taller than his knee, were a testament to the work of his ancestors, who had patiently coaxed a wild, scraggly grass called teosinte into this tall, generous plant over more generations than there were stars in the sky. He felt a deep satisfaction in the straightness of his lines and the dark, turned earth between them. Each stalk represented a promise of flower, of sustenance through the cool, dry season. The warmth on the back of his neck urged him to work faster, to finish clearing the last of the stubborn weeds before the midday rest. This steady rhythm was interrupted by a slow, shuffling step. His grandmother, Etotia, approached, her back a permanent curve like a weathered branch, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles. She carried a small clay pot in the crook of her arm. She said nothing at first, simply standing at the edge of the plot, her dark eyes scanning his work. Izel felt a familiar mix of respect and impatience. He knew she did not see the field as he did. He saw a simple calculation of stalks and harvest. She saw a complex conversation between the soil, the sky, and the spirits of the plants themselves. Her presence meant his efficient work was about to be made more complicated. Etotia finally gestured with her chin toward the base of a strong-looking maize stalk. "Here," she said, her voice soft and raspy, like dry leaves skittering on stone. She reached into her pot and pulled out a smooth, dark bean. "The maize grows tall and proud, but it is lonely. It needs a sister to keep it company." She pressed the bean into the soil beside the stalk. "The bean will climb to greet the sun, holding on to her brother for strength. In return for his support, she will feed the earth, giving back the strength the maize takes." Izel watched, his hands still. He had seen this done his whole life, but had never truly understood the purpose. To him, it seemed a waste of effort. His mind, quick and practical, saw only inefficiency. More maize stalks meant a bigger harvest. It was simple counting. Adding beans seemed to clutter the field, making it harder to weed and water. He imagined the climbing vines tangling the precious ears of corn, inviting pests and shadows where there should be open air and light. He wanted to explain this to her, to show her that a field dedicated to one purpose could produce more than one divided among three. But the certainty in her movements, a confidence born from countless seasons of watching things grow, kept him silent. Before he could find the words for his doubt, Etotia reached into her pot again. This time, she produced a large, pale, flat seed. "Every family needs a protector," she continued, moving to the open space between two rows of maize. She knelt, her old knees cracking softly, and pushed the squash seed into a small mound of earth. The squash will spread her wide leaves like a blanket. She will keep the sun from stealing the water from the soil, and will keep the weeds from breathing. She shelters her sisters while they grow. She looked up at Izel, her eyes asking if he understood that this was not just planting, but the building of a home. Izel finally spoke, his voice tight with unspoken disagreement. "Grandmother, if we fill the spaces with squash, where will we walk? How will we check the maize for worms? It will be a tangle." He gestured to the open, clean soil he had worked so hard to prepare. "This way is clean. It is easy to see everything." He felt a flush of frustration, the kind a young man feels when old ways seem to stand in the way of better, faster ones.
He saw the potential for a massive harvest of maize, the single most important food for his people, being compromised for the sake of these other, lesser plants. Etotia sighed, a small, quiet sound. She rose slowly and brushed the dirt from her hands. You see plants, Ezel. I see a community. Alone, the maize is greedy and stands weak against a strong wind. Alone, the bean has nowhere to climb. Alone, the squash vine bakes in the open sun. She gently touched a fuzzy green leaf on a young maize stalk. You think your straight lines are strong, but the strongest things are those that lean on each other. The three sisters do not take from the soil. They make it richer for their children and for yours. A deep worry creased her brow. She feared this new way of seeing only parts and not the whole would be a weakness for his generation. This gentle rebuke quieted him. He looked from his grandmother's earnest face to the field stretching before them. Her words painted a picture he had never considered. He had always thought of farming as a battle, him against the weeds, the plants against the dryness of the soil. He had never thought of it as a partnership, an alliance between different kinds of life. The logic of it began to settle in his mind, not as a command from an elder, but as a quiet truth revealing itself in the pattern of the leaves and the texture of the soil. He could not deny the health of the fields planted in the old way, nor the generations of his family they had fed. He let out a long breath, releasing his frustration with it. He picked up his digging stick, a simple tool of fire-hardened wood that had served his people for centuries. Without a word, he moved to the next maize stalk and made a small hole at its base, just as she had shown him. He then walked over to her and reached into her clay pot, his fingers closing around the cool, smooth surface of a bean. The feel of it in his palm was no longer an annoyance, but a piece of a larger puzzle he was just beginning to see. The rest of the afternoon passed in this new rhythm. For every stalk of maize, a bean found a home at its feet. Between the rows, mounds were prepared for the squash seeds that would become the living floor of the field. Ezel's movements became less rigid, more attuned to the needs of the emerging plant community. He began to see the wisdom in the spacing, the way the different plants would occupy the air, the soil, and the light, each in its own way, without fighting. As he prepared the soil for the final seed of the day, the low call of a motmot bird echoed from the trees at the valley's edge, signaling the slow approach of evening. The great river, the one Liblian's ancestors had coaxed into their fields, was now just a memory whispered by the cracked gray earth. Bo stood on what was once its bank, the ground beneath his feet a mosaic of hardened mud curling at the edges like dried leaves. He squinted toward the horizon, where a pale sky offered no promise of clouds, only a relentless clarity that made his eyes ache. Each breath he took felt dusty, coating his tongue and throat with the taste of the dead fields. He had walked this same path 1,000 times, feeling the soft yield of wet soil give way to his weight, but now each step sent a jarring crunch up through his bones. The silence was the worst part. The river's constant murmur was gone, replaced by a quiet so profound he could hear the faint, dry rustle of withered reeds. Returning to the village, Bo passed the paddies his family had tended for generations. They were no more than shallow earthen bowls baked by the sun, their surfaces fractured by fissures deep enough to swallow a man's arm. The tender green shoots of rice that should have been rustling in a gentle breeze were gone, having long ago turned to brittle yellow straw and then to dust. He remembered a time, not so long ago, when the sound of children's laughter would echo across these fields as they chased frogs in the channels. Now, the children were too weak to run. They sat in the slivers of shade offered by the huts, their movements slow, their eyes large and listless in their thin faces. The village had become a place of hushed movements and hollow sounds. Inside his own home, the familiar, comforting scent of cooking rice was absent. Instead, a faint, sour smell of hunger seemed to cling to the woven walls. His wife, Mai Lin, knelt by the hearth, scraping the inside of their last storage jar with a clamshell. The rhythmic scritch-scratch was a sound of desperation. She was trying to gather enough grains for a thin gruel, a watery broth that might quiet the ache in their daughter's belly but would not fill it. Their child, An Li, lay on a mat in the corner, her small chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. She did not even look up when he entered. This lethargy, this quiet fading of her spirit, was a terror that gripped Bo's heart more tightly than his own gnawing hunger. A sudden commotion from the center of the village broke the stillness. It was not a sound of joy or work, but a harsh mix of angry voices. Bo stepped outside, his muscles protesting the simple movement. A small, tense crowd had gathered before the hut of the Wen family, their neighbor. He saw the village headman, his face a grim mask, standing over a clay pot that had been overturned. Spilled across the dusty ground was a small pile of dark, oily, dried fish, and a mound of pale, fermented grains that gave off a sharp, vinegary smell. It was a treasure, a hoard of preserved food that could keep a family from the brink for weeks. A collective gasp, part outrage and part envy, rippled through the onlookers.
Slow pace. The Wen family stood huddled in the doorway of their home, the father looking defiant, the mother clutching their small son. The boy's face was just as gaunt as every other child's, a fact that seemed to make the betrayal even sharper. "They had this hidden," a man shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "They had this while my son chews on roots." The accusation hung in the still air, thick and ugly. Bo felt a surge of the same hot anger. He thought of An Li's listless form, of Mei Lin's scraping clamshell, and his fists clenched. The instinct to protect his own was a powerful physical force, urging him to demand a share, to take what his family needed to survive. But then his gaze fell upon the Wen's young son, who was crying silently, tears tracing clean paths through the grime on his cheeks. The boy was no fatter, no healthier than An Li. The sight pricked Bo's anger, letting a cold draft of confusion seep in. The Wens were not monsters, they were parents, just as terrified as he was. The headman raised a hand for silence, his authority unquestioned even in this desperate time. "This is not for the crowd to decide," he announced, his voice steady. "The elders will meet. We will remember the ways of our ancestors." He ordered 2 men to gather the spilled food carefully, every last fish and grain and bring it to the council hut. The community would pass judgment, not as a hungry mob, but as a people with laws and traditions. As the crowd dispersed into smaller, murmuring groups, Bo felt a profound weariness settle over him. He walked toward the council hut, feeling the weight of the community's shared history. He remembered the harvest festivals, the singing that would last late into the night, the songs that told of their unity. They sang of how one family's strength was the whole village's strength, how the river's bounty was a gift to be shared by all. Those songs felt like a lie now, their melodies drowned out by the scraping of empty pots and the angry shouts of neighbors. The very foundation of their life together, the pact of mutual reliance that had allowed them to tame the river, was cracking, just like the earth beneath their feet. Inside the long, windowless council hut, the elders sat in a solemn circle. Their faces, etched with the worry of a failed harvest, seemed carved from old wood. The headman presented the case with few words. The Wen family had acted out of fear, he explained, but in doing so, they had broken the bond of trust that held the village together. Now, a choice had to be made that went far beyond one family's transgression. It was a choice about who they were. Did the drought wash away their obligations to one another? Was survival now a contest where each family fought for itself against all others? Bo stood near the entrance, listening, his own heart a battlefield for these same questions. One elder, a man known for his rigid adherence to tradition, spoke first. His voice was as dry as the riverbed. "The rules are clear," he stated. "The food they hid must be added to the communal store, to be rationed by the council. The Wens brought shame upon us by showing a weak heart. They must be publicly shamed so everyone sees the cost of selfishness." His words found support among many. To enforce the old ways was to believe they still had meaning, to believe that their community was stronger than the drought. It was a vote for order in a world that was spinning into chaos. Then, a much older woman, whose eyes had seen more failed harvests than any other, spoke in a quiet, wavering voice. "And what will this punishment achieve?" she asked, her gaze sweeping over the grim faces. "It will not make the clouds gather. It will not fill the river. It will punish fear with more fear." She paused, letting the silence press in on them. "Perhaps this is a sign that we cannot live as we once did. When the river is generous, it is easy to share. Now perhaps every family must find its own path to survival." Her words were a frightening acknowledgement of their reality, suggesting that their songs of unity were only for times of plenty. Bo felt himself torn. The father in him, the man who watched his daughter fade, screamed that the old woman was right. His only duty was to his own blood. He should fight for every scrap of food, hoard what he could, and forget the songs. Let his family survive, even if the village did not. But the man who had helped build his neighbor's home, who had shared his tools, and who had sung the songs of their ancestors with a full heart, knew that such a path led to a lonely, bitter end. If they turned on each other, they would become no better than a pack of starving dogs. and the spirit of their people, the legacy of Leon and the water tamers, would perish long before their bodies did. Finally, the chief elder, a woman whose authority came not from age, but from a deep, quiet wisdom, rose to her feet. She did not look at the wens or the pot of confiscated food. Instead, she spoke to the entire council, her voice calm but firm. "Our strength has never been the rice in our jars," she began, her words echoing the very thoughts that had troubled Bo. "It has been the trust in our hearts. It is the knowledge that, if one of us falls, another will offer a hand." She declared that all families would bring what little stores they had left to the center of the village. The Wen's hoard would be the first contribution. Everything would be shared, rationed so that everyone ate something each day, no matter how small. The Wens would not be cast out. Instead, they were given a new, solemn duty. They would be the keepers of the sacred spring high in the hills, the last place where clean water trickled from the earth. Their task was to ensure it remained pure and to bring water to the weak and the elderly each day. It was a judgment that was both a punishment and a path to redemption, a task that forced them to serve the very community they had wronged. The decision was not about vengeance. It was about mending what had been broken. The council's verdict had left its heavy impression on the village, but the weary work of surviving in the parched, waiting land had to go on.
In the dense, damp forests of the north, life was a constant negotiation with the land. For Finn's people, this meant clearing small, twisting plots between ancient trees, where the soil was heavy and clung to their tools like a stubborn child. Every spring, he watched the men and women of his village guide their wooden ards, simple plows that were little more than sharpened branches, across the fields. The effort made their shoulders ache and their breath come in ragged bursts, yet the tool only managed to scratch a shallow groove in the dark earth. It was a tiring, frustrating dance that yielded just enough barley and rye to see them through the long, cold winters, but never enough to silence the fear of a poor harvest. As a blacksmith, Finn mended the splintered wood and reshaped the fire-hardened tips, but he knew the problem was not the woodworker's craft. It was the soil's unyielding strength. This familiar rhythm was broken by the arrival of a traveler from the south, a merchant whose cloak smelled of distant roads and strange spices. He spread his wares on a hide blanket in the center of the village: salt, colored beads, and fine woven cloth. But what caught Finn's eye was not the usual collection of goods. Tucked away in a leather sack was a single piece of dark, heavy metal shaped like a cruel tooth. The merchant called it an iron plowshare, a tip for a plow that, he claimed, could bite into the earth where wood could only scrape. He spoke of lands to the south where fields were wide and straight, and the soil turned over in dark, clean ribbons. The price was steep: a handful of the village's best amber, fossilized tree resin that held the light of the sun within it. After a tense negotiation among the village elders, the trade was made: the amber exchanged for a cold piece of the future. Finn held the iron share in his hands, feeling its incredible weight and the sharpness of its edge. It felt different from the iron he used for knives and spearheads. It was thicker,
cruder, built for brutality rather than finesse. He spent days studying it, turning it over and over, his mind racing. He envisioned a new kind of plow, not a light ard meant to be pulled by a single ox, but a heavier, sturdier frame that could withstand the force needed to drive this iron tooth deep into the ground. His own hands, calloused from the hammer and tongs, itched to begin the work. He saw in the metal not just a tool, but an answer to the strained backs and worried faces that defined the planting season. This single piece of iron was a promise of deeper roots and fuller grain heads. The familiar roar of the bellows filled his workshop as he began to forge the supporting parts for the new plow. He worked for days, the rhythmic clang of his hammer on hot metal a constant song in the village. The smell of burning coal and cooling iron drifted through the settlement, a scent of creation and change. He shaped thick pieces of oak for the beam and handles, fitting them together with iron braces. The work consumed him, and he barely noticed the passage of time, stopping only to eat the bread and dried meat his sister left for him. He was building something that had never been seen in these woods, a machine born from a traveler's tale and his own two hands. And with every strike of the hammer, he felt he was shaping more than just metal and wood. As the plow took shape, the village elders grew watchful, their conversations becoming hushed whenever he passed. One evening, Garrick, the oldest among them, came to his workshop. The old man's face was a map of wrinkles, and his eyes held the deep caution of a long life. He did not look at the plow, but at the earth floor of the forge. "The soil is the skin of the world, Finn," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We scratch it lightly to ask for its gifts. We do not wound it." He spoke of the spirits of the land, of the ancient balance that kept the forests healthy and the streams clean. To drive a blade of iron deep into the earth, he warned, was an act of arrogance. It was like tearing a wound that might never heal, angering the unseen guardians who gave them life. Finn listened with respect, his hammer resting silently on the anvil. He understood the elders' fear. It was the same fear that made them leave offerings at the base of the oldest oaks and whisper thanks to the river for its fish. Yet he also remembered the hollow look in a child's eyes during a lean winter, and the desperation of a failed crop. "Perhaps," Finn replied softly, "the earth is strong enough to bear it. Perhaps it wishes to give us more if we are only brave enough to ask in a new way." The conversation ended without agreement, leaving a tension between them that felt as heavy as the iron on his workbench. He was caught between honoring the traditions that had kept his people alive and embracing a change that might allow them to truly thrive. The day Finn finished the plow, a nervous energy settled over the village. He wheeled the heavy contraption out to a fallow field at the edge of the forest, the two thick wheels leaving deep ruts in the soft ground. Nearly everyone gathered to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity, hope, and the deep-seated suspicion Garrick had voiced. To show the difference, a neighbor first took his old wooden ard, pulled by a single straining ox. It skittered across the surface, snagging on roots and barely turning over the top layer of grass and soil. It was the familiar, difficult work they all knew. The shallow furrow it left behind seemed more like a plea than a command. Then it was Finn's turn. He hitched 2 oxen to his heavy plow, their combined strength needed to pull the new device. He gripped the handles, feeling the vibration as the iron plowshare met the ground.
With a shout to the oxen, they lurched forward. There was a great tearing sound, a noise no one had ever heard from a field before. The sound of iron shearing through the dense mat of roots and compacted soil. The plow did not scratch, it sliced. A thick, dark ribbon of earth, rich with the smell of damp soil and life, folded over cleanly beside the furrow. The cut was straight and deeper than any of them had ever seen, exposing the moist, fertile soil that had always remained just out of reach. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Some of the younger farmers stepped forward, their eyes wide with disbelief and excitement, touching the freshly turned earth as if it were a miracle. They saw bigger harvests, fuller bellies, and a life less governed by the constant threat of hunger. They saw a future where their labor might be rewarded with abundance. But Garrick and the other elders stood back, their faces grim. They did not see rich soil. They saw a deep, open wound in the flesh of the world. They watched Finn and his creation with a fear that was almost as powerful as the hope shimmering in the eyes of the young. The village was no longer united in its struggle with the land. It was now divided by the very tool that promised to save it. Finn left the plow standing in the middle of the field, a dark shape against the green forest wall. He did not feel like a hero or a villain, only a man who had set a heavy stone in motion and could not know where it would come to rest. He returned to his workshop, the scent of coal and hot metal a familiar comfort. As dusk settled over the forest, casting long shadows from the trees, Finn found a hard-won quiet in the familiar weight of his hammer, the one thing in his world that still felt simple and true. Newbie's life followed the rhythm of the river. Each morning he walked the narrow paths between fields of emmer wheat and barley, his bare feet sinking slightly into the damp, dark earth left by the annual flood. The work was predictable, a cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting that his father and his father's father had known. He drew water from the irrigation channel, his shoulders straining with the familiar weight of the wooden yoke. This careful work ensured his family would have bread and beer for another year. It was a life measured not in days, but in the height of the grain and the level of the Nile. Because of this well-established routine, anything that broke the pattern was felt by the entire community. This pattern was broken by a sound carried on the breeze, a strange mix of unfamiliar animal cries and human voices speaking in a clipped foreign tongue. A dust cloud on the horizon confirmed the source. A merchant caravan was approaching the trade outpost near the village. Newbie paused his work, leaning on his hoe and shielding his eyes. The sight of the lanky, swaying camels, creatures of the endless desert, was always a disruption. They brought with them not just goods, but a scent of distant lands, of dry sand, strange spices, and the sweat of a long journey. The arrival of such a caravan always sparked a current of excitement and suspicion through the village, as people wondered what new things and what new troubles were being carried in those heavy bales. Later that day, Newbie ventured to the outpost. The temporary market was a swirl of activity, a stark contrast to the quiet toil of the fields. Merchants in brightly colored cloth haggled over linen and pottery, while their servants tending to the grumbling camels. It was here, at the stall of a man with eyes the color of olives, that Newbie saw something new. Alongside the usual frankincense and carved beads were small sacks filled with tiny, unfamiliar seeds. The merchant, noticing his interest, scooped up a handful. Some were small, round, and wrinkled. Others were flat, like little stones. He explained through a translator that these were chickpeas and lentils, foods that could grow in the drier season, long after the barley was cut. This proposition was a dangerous temptation. A second harvest, even a small one, could change everything. Newbie's mind immediately went to his mother, whose breathing had grown shallow and raspy in the evenings. The village healer spoke of expensive herbs from the south, a price far beyond what a single harvest of wheat could provide. The merchant also showed him a dried fig, its sweetness an explosion in his mouth, and offered him the seeds to grow such a tree. He claimed these plants were a gift, a way to make the land yield its bounty twice a year. For a man whose entire existence was bound to a single precarious growing season, the idea felt like a form of magic, both wonderful and deeply unsettling.
The possibility, however, was tangled with risk. To try these new crops, Newbie would have to set aside a portion of his land that was proven to grow the wheat his family depended on. He would also have to use precious water from the canals during the dry months, water that was carefully rationed. What if these foreign plants failed to sprout in the Nile's soil? Or worse, what if they carried some hidden blight, a sickness that could spread to his wheat and ruin the one reliable harvest he had? The thought sent a chill through him, despite the warmth of the afternoon. Failure would not just mean disappointment, it would mean hunger. He sought the counsel of his neighbors that evening as they sat outside their mud brick homes. The advice he received was sharply divided, splitting along the familiar line of age and temperament. Old Kanaman, a man whose face was a map of past droughts and floods, shook his head gravely. "The gods gave us the Nile, the wheat, and the barley," he warned, his voice low. "Their rhythm is our rhythm. To plant strange seeds in the off-season is to invite chaos. Stick to the ways of the ancestors, Newbie. They are the only ways that have kept us alive." Kanaman's words were heavy with the weight of tradition, a powerful force in a world where survival depended on repeating what had worked before. However, his other neighbor, Bach, a younger man with 2 small children, saw it differently. His eyes were bright with possibility as he listened to Newbie's account. The ancestors didn't have camels bringing seeds from the end of the world, Bach argued, gesturing with excitement. Think of it, lentils for the stew pot when our grain is running low, figs for the children. This is a chance, not a curse. He spoke of affording better tools, of having something extra to trade, of building a life that was slightly less perched on the knife's edge of a single harvest. To him, the risk was worth the potential for a life with a little more security and a little less fear. That night, Newbie could not sleep.
He lay on his reed mat, the sounds of the village fading into the quiet hum of insects. In his mind, he saw the two paths laid out before him. One was the well-worn track of his father, safe, predictable, and narrow. It promised survival, but little more. The other path was obscured, leading into the unknown. It might lead to prosperity, to medicine for his mother and a fuller granary. Or it could lead to ruin, leaving his family with nothing but cracked, barren earth. The merchant's seeds felt like a test, a question being asked not just of him, but of his entire way of life. He thought of the wrinkled chickpeas in his palm, so different from the smooth, familiar grains of emmer wheat he had handled his entire life. They represented a world beyond the river valley, a world with different seasons, different soils, and different gods. To plant them would be an act of faith, not in the traditions that had always sustained his people, but in the word of a stranger and the resilience of a tiny foreign seed. It was a choice between the security of the past and a gamble on the future. Ultimately, it was the sound of his mother's soft cough from the other side of the hut that settled the debate in his soul. It was a sound of vulnerability, a reminder that the old ways, while safe, were not always enough. Before the first light touched the sky, he rose. He took a small portion of his savings, a handful of copper rings, and walked back toward the merchant's camp. He would buy the seeds. He would dedicate a small, carefully chosen plot of land, the one closest to the canal, to this experiment. The uncertainty of the decision settled in his stomach, a knot of hope and fear. The rhythm of the river that nourished his fields felt both a comforting promise and a silent, ancient challenge. The compacted earth of the wall was warm under Anne's sandals, a solid presence between the world he knew and the world he was taught to fear. Below him, the neat squares of millet shimmered, their green heads nodding in a breeze that carried the scent of dry soil and growing things. This was the work of his people, the digging of channels, the patient tending of stalks, the rhythm of planting and harvesting that defined every season. His hand rested on the smooth, worn wood of his spear, a tool as much a part of his life as the hoe was to the farmers in the fields. Beyond the last cultivated patch, the land changed completely. The world of the plow and the irrigation ditch ended, and the great grassy steppe began, stretching out until it met the pale, hazy edge of the sky. This vast emptiness was not truly empty. Anne squinted, his eyes tracing the horizon where the land seemed to ripple. He had been taught that it was the home of the horsemen, people who lived in the saddle and followed their herds of sheep and goats across the endless grass. To the people in his town, they were a source of fear, spoken of in hushed tones as raiders who descended like locusts to steal grain and livestock. The elders told stories of burned villages and scattered families, tales that made the wall feel like a comforting embrace. Yet a memory of a merchant passing through last spring surfaced in his mind. The man had spoken of them differently, describing proud clans whose ancient grazing routes were being steadily consumed by the relentless spread of farms, forcing them into ever more desperate corners of the world. A flicker of movement far to the north broke the stillness. It was not a bird, nor a trick of the heated air. It was a faint plume of dust, small and innocent at this distance, like a bit of kicked-up dirt. Anne's stomach tightened. He knew what it meant. He had seen it before, but never so large. Leaning over the parapet, he called down to a runner who was carrying water to the field workers. The young boy looked up, saw where Anne was pointing, and immediately dropped his buckets, sprinting back toward the town gates with a speed born of shared anxiety. The quiet orderliness of the afternoon was shattered. Below, farmers began gathering their tools with a hurriedness that betrayed their alarm, their voices carrying up to the wall in a low hum of concern. The older guard, Gia, shuffled over, his joints cracking. He spat a stream of brown juice from the betel nut he was chewing. "There they are," he grumbled, his voice rough as grinding stones. "Right on time. They can smell a full granary from 100 leagues away, I swear it." He looked at the dust cloud, which was now visibly wider, a smudge against the clean sky. "Mark my words, boy, they live like wolves, and they think like wolves. They see our fields and our storehouses not as the fruit of hard labor, but as a feast laid out for them by weaker creatures." Gia's certainty was as solid as the wall itself, a belief shared by everyone inside its protection. This perspective was the bedrock of their world, the justification for the endless watchfulness. As the news spread, the town magistrate appeared near the main gate, his silk robes a stark contrast to the dusty earth. His voice, though not loud, carried an authority that cut through the rising panic. He ordered the gates barred and the granary sealed. Immediately, the sounds of the town changed. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer was replaced by the frantic sharpening of spearheads and arrow tips. The chatter of the marketplace gave way to the anxious whispers of families securing the shutters on their homes. Anne watched it all from above, feeling the tremor of the great wooden bar sliding into place at the gate. The sound was a deep, final thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of their settlement. The scout who had ridden out at dawn galloped back toward a small hidden postern gate, his horse lathered in sweat. He shouted his report up to the captain of the guard. It was not just one clan, but a large confederation of tribes moving with purpose. Their numbers were greater than any raiding party seen in a generation. A cold dread seeped through Anne, a feeling heavier than the afternoon's warmth. The spear in his hands suddenly felt inadequate, a mere stick against a rising tide. He looked from the frantic preparations within the walls to the growing cloud on the horizon, and felt trapped between two unstoppable forces, the fear of his own people and the desperation of those coming toward them. His duty was clear. He was a guard. His purpose was to protect the harvest, to defend the families who slept behind these earthen ramparts. The millet in the fields represented more than just food. It was their future, the product of a year of back-breaking toil, of trust in the soil and the seasons. To lose it would mean starvation, a winter of empty bellies and hollow-eyed children. This was the truth he had been raised with, the core of his responsibility. He gripped his spear tighter, the wood familiar and reassuring. He was a protector of this way of life, a life built on the certainty of a seed planted in the ground. And yet, the trader's words echoed in his thoughts, unsettling his simple sense of duty. The man had described the nomads' reverence for the open sky, their deep knowledge of pasture lands, and their sorrow at seeing the earth cut open by plows. He wondered if they saw the wall not as a fortress, but as a cage, a barrier that held a strange people who chose to stay in one place, tethered to the soil, hoarding its bounty. The thought was disloyal, dangerous even, but it lingered. Was the wall truly just to keep the horsemen out? Or was it also meant to keep his own people in, reinforcing a world of boundaries and ownership that the people of the steppe could never understand? As the sun began to dip lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, the dust cloud resolved into the distinct shapes of hundreds of horsemen. They were still too far to see clearly, but their presence was an undeniable weight on the landscape. They did not rush forward, but seemed to be making a camp, their small fires beginning to twinkle in the fading light. The sight was both menacing and strangely beautiful. They were a community, just like his own, settling down for the night under the same sky. The shared humanity of that simple act made the sharpening of spears below feel like a terrible mistake.
The tension in the town was a palpable thing, a low thrum of fear that seemed to rise with the evening insects. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every gust of wind sounded like the thundering of hooves. Anne remained at his post, his muscles aching from the strain of constant watchfulness. He saw the magistrate directing the distribution of arms, his face a mask of grim determination. He saw mothers pulling their children inside, their faces pale with worry. The entire town was bracing for a conflict that felt both ancient and immediate, a clash between the seed and the saddle, the field and the open range. In the gathering twilight, Anne looked out over the darkened fields toward the distant campfires of the nomads. The wall felt less like a shield and more like a line drawn in the dirt, a boundary between two different ways of being in the world. He was born on one side, and his entire life had been defined by it. But for the first time, he found himself wondering with a profound and unsettling curiosity about the lives of those on the other. As darkness settled over the plains, he carried the weight of the day's fears and questions with him into the long, watchful night. Elu's world was shaped by the scent of damp clay and the sharp green smell of freshly cut reeds. In the long, narrow room he shared with a dozen other junior scribes, the only sound was the soft, rhythmic scratching of a stylus, a tool made from a river reed against wet earth. His hands, unlike those of most men he knew, were soft and clean, marked only by the occasional smudge of dark ink. His work was to bring order to the world, pressing the neat, wedge-shaped marks of their writing system into tablets that recorded the lifeblood of the city of Uruk. Each symbol was precise, a container for a fact, a measure of barley, a jug of beer, a head of livestock.
This order was a source of deep satisfaction. When he completed a tablet listing the tribute brought from a surrounding village, he would set it in the sun to bake, turning the pliable clay into a permanent record. It felt important, a small part in the great work of the city and its temple. The priests taught that this accounting was an offering to the gods, a way of showing that their earthly domain was well managed and prosperous. Elu believed them, finding a quiet pride in the straightness of his columns and the clarity of his symbols. The farmers brought the grain, the shepherds brought the lambs, and he, Elu, gave it all a name and a number, making it real in the eyes of the city and the heavens. This particular work involved the accounting from the villages upriver, those that fed the city's heart. He pressed the symbol for 100 measures of wheat from his own cousin's village, a place he had not seen in years. He remembered the feel of mud between his toes as a child, but the memory was faint, overshadowed by the cool stone floors of the temple complex where he now lived and worked. The numbers on the tablet were clean and abstract, representing a wealth that flowed into the city's great ziggurat, the stepped mountain built for the gods, which stood so tall it seemed to hold up the sky. It fed the priests, the soldiers who guarded the walls, and the artisans who carved statues of distant kings. The perfection of his work felt different to Elu later that evening after a visitor had arrived. His cousin, Ashur, stood awkwardly in the small, bare room where Elu slept. Ashur was broader and darker, his skin turned to leather by his labor, and his hands were thick and calloused, with dirt worked deep into the lines of his palms. He moved stiffly, and Elu could see the exhaustion etched around his eyes. He had brought a small sack of onions and a piece of dried fish as a gift, a humble offering that seemed out of place in the grand austerity of the temple grounds. They sat on woven reed mats, sharing a thin barley loaf. At first, Asher spoke of family, of births and illnesses, his voice low and tired. But as the shadows deepened in the room, the talk turned to the fields. He spoke of the labor, a constant battle from before sunrise to after sunset. His words painted a picture of aching backs and muscles that burned from digging and clearing the irrigation ditches that channeled the river's life into the soil. He described a constant fear that hung over the village, the fear of not meeting the temple's quota, a number delivered by an overseer and recorded by a scribe just like Elu. "The work is harder now than it was in our father's time," Asher murmured, breaking the barley bread with a cracking sound. He looked at his powerful, damaged hands as if they belonged to someone else. "The city takes more water each year for its canals. The river is lower when it reaches us, and the water we get is sluggish. It doesn't wash the land clean as it once did." He paused, and his next words were heavy with a worry that went beyond a single poor harvest. "The earth itself is growing sick, cousin. In some of the lower fields,
it sweats a white crust, a salt that poisons the barley before it can ripen. Asher's words lingered in the quiet room long after he had gone, leaving Elu with the faint scent of river fish and dry dust. The scribe looked at his own smooth hands, hands that had never felt the strain of a digging stick or the rough texture of a grain stalk. He thought of the tablet he had inscribed that very afternoon, the one marking the tribute from Asher's village. The clean, confident symbols seemed to mock him now. The number for 100 measures of wheat was not just a mark on clay. It was his cousin's aching back, his cracked hands, and the growing fear of a field that refused to give life. That night, Elu could not find rest easily. He left his small chamber and walked through the moonlit courtyards of the temple complex. The air was cool against his skin, a relief from the day's stored warmth. He found himself standing before one of the city's massive granaries, a clay brick storehouse larger than any building in his cousin's village. Even in the dark, he could smell the dry, dusty scent of immense quantities of grain stored within, a mountain of food protected by thick walls and official seals. It was enough to feed the city for years, a bulwark against famine and a symbol of the city's power. This great hoard of grain was the foundation of his world. It allowed him to spend his days learning to read and write. It paid the soldiers who kept the peace, and it funded the creation of beautiful things to honor the gods. He had always seen it as a sign of their greatness, a testament to a system that brought order and security out of the chaos of nature. But now, looking at the silent, imposing structure, he saw something else. He saw the countless hours of labor, the strained muscles, and the slow poisoning of the soil, all compressed and stored away behind these walls. He felt a profound and unsettling disconnect between the symbols he so carefully crafted and the human effort they represented. His world of neat tablets and precise accounts was built upon a world of sweat, pain, and growing desperation. The prosperity of Uruk, with its towering ziggurat and its hundreds of scribes and priests, was not created from nothing. It was drawn from the soil, through the bodies of men and women like Ashur, whose own land was beginning to die from the city's thirst. The question that arose in his mind felt dangerous, a challenge to the very structure of his life. Was this balance fair? Did the gods truly desire a system where some hands grew soft from holding a stylus, while others were broken by the plow? He had been taught that every person had their place, that the farmer's labor was a sacred duty, just as his own was. Yet the weariness in his cousin's eyes and the talk of salty, barren earth spoke not of sacred duty, but of a slow and grinding depletion. He returned to his room and sat before his small workbench. The clay for the next day's work was covered with a damp cloth, soft and ready. His reeds were sharpened to a fine point, prepared for the morning's accounting. For the first time, his role felt less like a noble calling and more like a link in a chain. He was the one who translated his cousin's sweat into a number that justified the city's endless hunger for more. The system was too vast to challenge, a river of power that had been flowing for generations. He was a small reed on its bank, not a rock that could change its course. To speak of such doubts would be to invite scorn, perhaps even punishment for questioning the divine order of things. He found himself caught between the pride he took in his craft and a newly discovered shame for what it might represent, a tool not just of order, but of extraction. Ilu laid out his reeds for the morning, the cool clay waiting on the shelf nearby. Tomorrow would bring its own columns of numbers, its own lists of tribute. He would press the same symbols into the same soft earth, but he knew they would never feel the same again. Each wedge-shaped mark would now carry the weight of his cousin's weariness and the silent sorrow of the dying soil. The accounting would continue, but the account itself had been forever changed in his heart. Marcus stood on the low hill overlooking his estate, his shadow stretching long in the morning light of Hispania. Below him, the olive groves were a sea of silver green, the rows as straight and disciplined as the legionary cohorts he had once commanded. 20 years of service, from the misty forests of Germania to the sun-scorched frontiers of Syria, had earned him this land, this latifundia, a vast agricultural estate. He ran it with the same precision he had learned in the army. Each task had its time, each worker their place. He felt a familiar satisfaction in the order of it all, a sense of purpose in turning this wild land into a productive machine. This was a different kind of campaign, fought not with sword and shield, but with plow and pruning hook. Yet, as he watched the distant figures of his slaves moving through the trees, a flicker of something unfamiliar, something unsettling, stirred within him. The workforce moved with a practiced, rhythmic efficiency. He saw them not as individuals, but as a single unit, their movements coordinated by the sharp calls of the overseer. There were nearly 200 of them, Gauls and Britons mostly, captured in campaigns he himself might have fought in. They were strong, hardy, and, most importantly, they were his property, as much as the trees they tended. He remembered his father's farm in the hills of Umbria, a small patch of earth worked by his parents, his siblings, and himself. He had known the name of their single stubborn ox and the unique creak of each gate. Here, the workers were nameless faces, their lives a mystery to him. They were simply another resource to be managed for maximum yield, their strength a line item in the great accounting of his enterprise. His overseer, Gaius, a sharp-eyed freedman who had earned his liberty through relentless competence, approached him, wiping dust from his brow with the back of a hand. "The first press will be ready by midday, Dominus," Gaius reported, his voice crisp. "The yield looks strong this year. If the weather holds, we will fill 1,000 amphora." An amphora was a tall clay jar, the standard vessel for shipping oil and wine across the sea. Gaius spoke of the harvest not in terms of bounty or blessing, but of quotas and transport logistics. "I have pushed the crews hard. A few are showing signs of exhaustion, but they will hold up. We cannot afford to fall behind schedule. Marcus nodded, appreciating the man's focus. Efficiency was the engine of the empire, and his estate was a vital cog in that machine. Later, Marcus descended to the pressing house. The heavy, earthy scent of crushed olives hung in the space, catching in his throat. Two massive stone wheels, turned by a pair of weary-looking oxen, ground the fruit to a thick paste in a stone basin. The paste was then layered between woven mats and placed under a great wooden lever press. Slaves, their bodies slick with a mixture of sweat and oil, strained to turn the large screw that lowered the beam, forcing the golden green liquid to trickle out into collection vats. The rhythmic thud and creak of the machinery was the sound of money. This was not the simple act of making food. It was manufacturing a commodity. The oil produced here would not anoint his family's bread, but would fill the lamps of senators and merchants in Rome, a city he hadn't seen in a decade. Gaius handed him a small clay cup of the freshly pressed oil. It was peppery and vibrant on his tongue, a taste of the rich soil he now commanded. Yet, the flavor transported him back to his childhood kitchen. He saw his mother, her hands stained, using a small, simple stone to crush a handful of olives from their single tree. That small bowl of oil was a treasure, used sparingly, its creation a moment of quiet family ritual. The oil in his cup now was of a far higher quality, purer and cleaner, but he found himself thinking that his mother's had somehow tasted better. He pushed the thought away as a foolish sentiment, the weakness of a man growing soft in his retirement. The empire was not built on sentiment. From the olive press, he walked toward the vineyards, where the story was much the same. Endless rows of vines marched across the rolling hills, their leaves just beginning to turn yellow at the edges. The grapes had already been harvested, fermented, and were now aging in enormous clay dolia, burial urn-sized jars sunk into the cool earth of the cellar. This wine was not for the local town, nor for his own table. It was destined for the legions on the Rhine frontier, a carefully calculated provision shipped in specially marked jars that identified its origin and quality. His estate was a node in a web that spanned the known world, a fact that filled him with a profound sense of importance. He was feeding the empire, fueling his legions, oiling its commerce. In his villa, a sprawling but functional building with cool tiled floors, he reviewed the accounts with his scribe. The symbols on the wax tablets represented vast quantities of goods. He saw the numbers detailing the sale of last season's wine to a shipping merchant in Carthago Nova, and the contract for this season's oil with a buyer who supplied the city of Rome. The profit was substantial, enough to purchase more land, more slaves, and more influence. He felt the familiar thrill of a successful commander reviewing his conquest. He had conquered this land, not with an army, but with capital and organization. His personal connection to the soil was purely commercial, a matter of inputs and outputs, profit and loss. This system was powerful, a testament to Roman ingenuity. It allowed a city of 1 million people to be fed, an army of hundreds of thousands to be supplied, and a peace to be maintained across provinces. Marcus was proud to be a part of it.
He had brought order to this landscape, just as the legions had brought order to the world. He provided a valuable commodity, and in return, he was rewarded with wealth and status. It was a fair exchange, a logical system that benefited all who participated, from the emperor in his palace to the merchant in the forum. It was the way of the world, the foundation of their civilization. The small, self-sufficient farms of his youth were a thing of the past, inefficient and sentimental. And yet the memories persisted, unbidden. He remembered the festival of the harvest back in Umbria, the entire village coming together to share food and wine, to celebrate their collective survival for another year. He remembered the taste of the bread made from wheat his own father had sown and reaped, a flavor he could not find in the fine loaves baked by his kitchen slaves. He remembered the feeling of the earth under his own hands, the direct and honest exhaustion that came from working for one's own sustenance. Here, his hands were clean, his labor was intellectual, and his exhaustion came from managing others, a different and less satisfying weariness. The contradiction unsettled him more than any barbarian ambush ever had. He was a master of a vast and profitable enterprise, a man of considerable standing. He had achieved everything a retired soldier could hope for. But as he looked out at the perfectly ordered rows of trees, worked by nameless people, producing a product he would never see consumed, he felt a profound sense of disconnection. The farm of his childhood, with its single ox and meager surplus, felt more real, more vital than this entire sprawling factory. He was a steward of the land, yet he felt like he did not truly know it. He had gained the world, but perhaps lost the soil. He stepped out onto the portico as evening began to settle, the air cooling slightly on his skin. He could hear the distant, rhythmic sounds from the pressing house, a sound that would continue long into the night. It was the sound of progress, the sound of empire. Around the estate, the familiar sounds of disciplined labor continued their new and relentless rhythm, a pulse that beat in time with the great heart of Rome itself. Thomas followed his father along the narrow path that divided their family's strips of land from their neighbors. To his left, the wheat stood green and promising, its slender stalks reaching for the pale spring sky. To his right, the barley was just beginning to show, a faint fuzz of life over the dark, tilled earth. His father, John, stopped and pointed with a gnarled finger toward their third strip of land, a long, weedy rectangle stretching toward the woods. It was covered in thistle and coarse grasses, a patch of chaos next to the ordered rows of their crops. John nodded with satisfaction, his face a map of wrinkles carved by decades of wind and sun. "See, boy, she rests. You work the soil, and then you let her rest. 1 year for wheat, 1 for barley, and 1 to sleep. That is the rhythm. It is the only way." This deep-seated belief was as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oak that marked the village boundary. For as long as anyone could remember, this was how the land was worked. The village fields were a patchwork of these strips,
each family tending its own portions within the great open fields. His father spoke of it as a pact made with the earth itself, a promise not to demand too much. Yet, as Thomas looked at the fallow ground, he felt a prickle of impatience. Rest felt like waste. While their strip lay tangled in weeds, he knew their single cow grew thin over the winter on meager hay, and the soil, even after its year of sleep, never seemed to give back as much as it once had. His father saw tradition and respect. Thomas was beginning to see a slow, quiet starvation of the land itself. However, what Thomas saw over the stone wall of the Lord's estate painted a different picture. On his walks to the mill, he had watched the Lord's men working their fields in a new and puzzling way. Where a fallow field should have been, a carpet of deep green clover covered the ground, buzzing with bees. In another season, he saw them planting rows of broad-leafed turnips, their purple-topped roots peeking from the soil. The Lord's sheep, moved from one green plot to the next, were fatter and their wool thicker than any in the village. This wasn't land left to sleep under a blanket of weeds. It was land put to a different kind of work, a work that seemed to feed the soil even as it fed the animals. The sight stirred a dangerous question in his mind. What if his father's way, the only way he had ever known, was not the only way after all? One evening, as they sat by the small fire, the scent of wood smoke clinging to the damp cottage air, Thomas found the courage to speak. "Father," he began, his voice hesitant, "I saw the Lord's men. They plant clover where their fields should be fallow, and turnips. The sheep graze on it, and I've heard it makes the soil richer for the next year's wheat." John stopped cleaning his pipe and looked at his son, his eyes narrowing. "That is foolishness, new-fangled nonsense from books. We are not lords with fences and endless fields to ruin with experiments. We follow the ways of our grandfathers because their ways work. They keep us fed. To plant something in the resting year is to cheat the earth. It is greedy, and the earth will punish greed with blight and famine." The finality in his father's voice was like a stone wall, leaving no room for argument. The conversation was over, but the idea was not. It took root in Thomas's mind, growing with a stubborn persistence. He felt torn between two powerful forces: the deep love and respect he had for his father, a man who had wrested a living from this very soil his entire life, and the clear, undeniable evidence he saw with his own eyes. The Lord's wheat grew taller, his cattle were heavier. His estate did not seem punished by the earth. It seemed rewarded. Thomas began to feel that true respect for the land wasn't about leaving it alone, but about understanding it better. He wondered if the old ways were not wisdom, but simply a habit born of a time when no one knew a better path. The conflict left a hollow ache in his chest, a silence between him and his father that felt wider than the fallow field between them. Seasons turned, and with them the cycles of life and labor. The wheat was harvested, the barley was cut, and his father, weakened by a winter cough that never quite left, leaned more heavily on Thomas's strength. The arguments about the fields faded, replaced by the quiet duties of care. Then came the spring,
when Thomas walked the paths between the strips alone. The weight of his father's tools felt different in his hands now, heavier with the burden of sole responsibility. He stood before the fallow strip, the same tangle of weeds and grasses his father had looked upon with such reverence. He saw his father's face in his mind, heard his stern warning against cheating the earth. For a moment, he felt the powerful pull of tradition, the comfort of walking a well-worn path. Yet, as he stood there, another vision rose just as strongly. The image of the Lord's lush clover, the sight of healthy animals, the thought of a granary filled, not just enough to survive, but enough to feel secure. His family's future rested not on his father's memories, but on the yields of the coming years. His choice was not between obedience and defiance, but between stagnation and possibility. He took a deep breath, the cool air filling his lungs, and made a decision. He would not be cheating the earth. He would be making a new pact with it, one based on observation and hope rather than just memory and fear. It was a risk, a step into the unknown that felt both terrifying and necessary. With a resolve that settled his unease, Thomas set to work. He hitched their old ox to the heavy wooden plow, and, instead of letting the weeds grow, he broke the fallow ground. The plowshare bit into the soil, turning over thick clods of earth that smelled of dampness and decay. It was hard, grueling work, different from preparing the other fields that had been softened by recent crops. Neighbors paused in their own work, watching him with curious, doubtful eyes. He heard their hushed whispers, imagining their thoughts. "John's boy has strange ideas," they might be saying. "He works the resting field. No good will come of it." He ignored them. His focus narrowed to the furrow unfolding before him, a dark, straight line drawn across the landscape of tradition. He bartered a sack of their best seed wheat for a small, precious bag of turnip seeds from the Lord's bailiff, a man who smirked at his ambition but took his grain all the same. He sowed the tiny, dark seeds into the newly prepared soil, his hands moving with a purpose that quieted the lingering voice of his father's disapproval. Day by day he tended the plot, his heart jumping at the first sight of the pale green shoots pushing through the soil. The broad, healthy leaves of the turnips grew quickly, their green a shocking splash of vitality on a strip that should have been dormant. It was a visible declaration of his choice, a testament to a new cycle beginning. Now, months later, Thomas stood on the small hill overlooking the village fields as the evening light softened the edges of the world. Below him lay the familiar patchwork, the golden stubble of the harvested wheat field, the green of the young barley, and in the third strip, his strip, the dense, leafy green of a flourishing turnip crop. The sight was still strange, a break in the ancient pattern that had governed this land for 1,000 years. It was a promise of more fodder for their cow, more manure to enrich the soil, and an end to wasted land. He looked at the rich, dark earth he had turned over, a direct link in a long, unbroken chain stretching back through time. He felt a connection to all those who had come before. A woman scattering wild seeds by a distant spring, a girl learning to tame a great river, a boy planting 3 sister crops together. They had all looked at the soil and dared to ask if there was a better way.
The scent of the cool, living earth rose up to meet him as he stood on the edge of a world that was, slowly and quietly, beginning to change. And so, our journey through the long furrows of human agriculture concludes for the evening. Consider the quiet trust of the first hand that pushed a seed into the soil, an act of faith in the turning of the seasons. For millennia, this has been our story, a history written not in ink, but in the patient tending of the earth, a rhythm of work and rest repeated through countless generations. It is a legacy of resilience, of watching and waiting, of nurturing life from the quiet ground. As you now prepare for your own time of rest, let that ancient, steady cadence guide you. Let your mind become like that fallow field, lying peaceful under a soft darkness, replenishing its strength for the morning to come. May your dreams be gentle, and your sleep as deep and restorative as the winter earth. Good night.